living on the road.
Hey VC, this is Chris. I'm here to do a follow-up video. Recently I did a video called American Folk Music, and so this one will be sort of father and son of American folk music, because it kind of goes both ways. The earlier one sort of focused on collegiate or pop or preppy folk type stuff like Kingston Trio and the Limelighters, and this one will build upon that and go backwards and forwards in time from it. So to begin with, part of the main reference was Pete Seeger was a focus on that, and Woody Guthrie. They started in the 40s and 50s and led up to this folk revival that, the Kingston Trio and the Limelighters and Chad Mitchell Trio and the other people built upon. But so here's Smithsonian Folkways presents Bound for Glory. So this is just a compilation CD that includes Woody Guthrie, New Lost City Ramblers, Doc Watson with Gene Ritchie, Leadbelly, Brownie McGee, Dave Van Ronk, Doc Boggs. So various artists in the early folk vein. I think this came included in something else that I bought, but it's a good acquisition. Bound for Glory on Smithsonian Folkways. So Pete Seeger was the start of this. When I showed the last video, James Griffith commented that there was a book out that he had read that, commented or supplied a lot of details or covered this whole area. So I went out and found a copy at the local library branch. It's called Dylan Goes Electric by Elijah Wald. And so this covers basically like 1960 to 1970, 63 to 70. So it's sort of biographical, and it sort of just covers the music scene in general. But how it started out with folk, and then the collegiate preppy pop faction started up, and there was division within the folk realm, the neo-ethnic folk people, the preppy folk people, mainstream folk versus traditionalist folk, and people fell into various camps or they overlapped in them, and Dylan came along and sort of superseded all the categories. But Dylan, a couple of his, one of his mentors or heroes was Woody Guthrie, and Pete Seeger was there throughout the whole thing, sort of overseeing it. And Newport Folk Festival was important within the whole scope of this folk revival. So here's an earlier Pete Seeger album. This is on Folkways record. I think this is 1957. So American Ballads. So Gypsy Davy, St. John's Hospital, Jesse James, Pretty Polly, John Hardy, Barbara Allen, John Henry, just a few of the titles that he did. So Pete Seeger, father of, well, he had a brother, Mike. I think he had a sister that was involved too. Another important figure in this early folk movement, Leadbelly, Negro folk songs for young people. This was also on Folkways. If I can get this oriented properly. Doesn't seem to want to cooperate, but yeah, you sort of saw it. Dave Van Ronk was another person involved in this early movement. He was more on the blues side rather than the folk, but you know, they all kind of built upon each other. This is on Verve Folkways. This is the early 60s. And then Bob Dylan. So this is, I think this is his second album, 1963, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. This includes Blowing in the Wind, which was a big hit for several other artists and maybe a minor hit for Bob Dylan. This is on Columbia. So this is a later reissue. He was still developing his style, going from just covering and maintaining older folk traditions and developing his own writing style. So as we see, here's another Pete Seeger record, Broadside, on still on Folkways. Broadside Ballads Volume 2. So this includes Pete Seeger covering songs by, there's 2 Dylan songs on the first side and 1 Dylan song on the second side. Malvina Reynolds, Tom Paxton, does 2 Tom Paxton songs. Peter Lafarge. So several artists from the early folk era. So Broadside Ballads Volume 2, Pete Seeger on Folkways. Another artist in this early time period was Joan Baez. I think this is her first album. This is on self-titled on Vanguard. It's just her and Fred Hellerman on both on guitars. And then here's her a later album. Now she's got an entire band behind her, and she's covering Bob Dylan songs. First one was traditional and self-composed albums. Now she's got 3 Bob Dylan songs on the first side and 1 Bob Dylan song on the second side of this album. Vanguard, another early artist, Buffy St. Marie. I think I showed this earlier. This is also on Vanguard, early 60s. These are mostly self-composed titles. Hetty West, another early female folk artist. Again on Vanguard, she accompanies herself on banjo. So this is called Hetty West Volume 2. And in that early folk era, Jim Kweskin, jug band music. Again on Vanguard. From what I've shown, you'd think Vanguard was the only label then, but maybe I'll run into an Elektra or Columbia at some point. Jim Kweskin, Maria Mulder was on this. Bill Keith, who went on to some bluegrass bands later. Now, like, this is the son of folk type thing. Here's Barry McGuire and the New Christy Minstrels, rather than New Minstrel Minstrels with Barry McGuire. This is on Columbia. Well, this is actually Pickwick, so a subsidiary. And then he went on to his solo album, big hit Eve of Destruction, Barry McGuire. This is on Dunhill. Does some P.F. Sloan songs, several of those. Baby Blue by Bob Dylan. I think that's She Belongs to Me. So 2 Bob Dylan songs, bunch of P.F. Sloan songs, and some Barry McGuire songs. So Dunhill. At this point, not even ABC Dunhill, just Dunhill. And Doc Watson was part of this, in the early Newport Folk Festival era. I think this is his debut album, 1962. He may have put out some earlier music, but I think it was produced later. But this is the first of his, where he's the lead artist. Doc Watson, self-titled on Vanguard. So a bunch of traditional folk songs. Again, he's got a bunch of records out, so he might end up being an entire video by himself. Doc Watson. Oscar Brand, another folk singer in that era. This is on Elektra. An odd looking Electra label. Boating songs and all that bilge. And Malvina Reynolds. So this was a later album by her, 1975. But she was also providing songs to people in the early 60s and appearing at the Newport Folk Festival back then. So, Cassandra label, Malvina Reynolds. Now, just some albums representing, what was going on in general back then. In the early 60s, here's this various artist compilation folk festival. So Judy Collins, Theodore Bickel, Rod McEwen, Glenn Campbell, Pete Seeger, Glenn Yarborough, the Dillards, Mason Williams, Odetta, Lightning Hopkins, Brownie and Sonny, Ed McCurdy, Oscar Brand, and Will Holt. This is on Legacy label. Subsidiary of Elektra. And another one, I mentioned the big three in the last video, which I said was the big collegiate three, Kingston Trio, Limelighters, and Chad Mitchell. But here's another three of a kind, Leadbelly, Bill Bronzy, and Josh White. Three other folk singers. This is on Design Records. They each do several songs on this album. Leadbelly, Bill Bronzy, and Josh White. And then a little bit of a later album, 65, 66. I may have shown a different version of this. Fred Neil, I think this is a reissue of Bleecker and McDougal. So Fred Neil, folk singer, accompanied by John Sebastian, Felix Pappalardi, Douglas Hatfield, or Hattelied it says here, and Pete Childs. So Fred Neil, he did The Other Side of This Life, Bleecker and McDougal. Later on he did The Dolphin, which Quicksilver covered on Marian Maiden. So mid-60s. And then another Son of, so this is John Stewart, who had, filled in Kingston Trio after Dave Guard left. And then he went out on his own, and here he is in a, supported with Buffy Ford, providing female vocals. Signals Through the Glass. This is late 60s. on Capitol. July, You're a Woman is the main song I recognize off this album. And then he went on to another 20, 30 years worth of releases. Tim Rose, a little bit later than this, the early folk revival. This is late 60s. He does a version of Hey Joe on here. Morning Dew. Also has Felix Pappalardi supporting him on that particular track. Come Away Melinda, which was also covered by Uriah Heep. Morning Dew covered by Jeff Beck Group, amongst others. So Tim Rose on Columbia. Columbia 2i. And then the last three are new acquisitions. I went to the local record store, Vertical House Records. I think this is my second visit, but the first time I actually bought anything. So it seems like a reasonable place. So first one I got was Buck Owens. It takes people like you to make people like me. I think this is mid to late 60s on Capitol. And then I picked up this Ian and Sylvia album. I think this was the maybe the only one I was missing. This is late 60s also. After they'd moved to MGM. Ian and Sylvia, Full Circle. So, folk from north of the border in Canada. And then the last one I got was from England, United Kingdom, Ian Campbell Folk Group with Dave Swarbrick accompanying them. So English folk from the mid to late 60s. This is on Electra. With the punch-out hole there. So Ian Campbell Folk Group. So that was my American Folk Part 2, or Sons and Daughters of American Folk, and with some new acquisitions, recent pickups. So thanks everybody for watching. See you later.